One special behavior that I need to point out about value types is that value types are typically immutable, which means they cannot change. And certainly the value types that Microsoft provides as primitives for us to work with from the .NET framework, those value types are immutable. And that means that once you create a value, you cannot change the value. That doesn't mean that the value stored in a variable cannot change. We call them variables because the data inside can vary, but the actual value of the value type cannot change. So for example, you cannot change the value of the integer value 4, that seems obvious, but it also means that once you've constructed a datetime, which is a value type, that particular value cannot change. So with this in mind, I want to cover two common errors that new C# developers frequently run into. One error with a datetime value type and one error with a string type. Once you construct a datetime, and yes, you can use the new operator, you can construct a datetime and set that datetime value to August 11th of the year 2002, which is what the code on the screen is doing. That's because the datetime constructor takes the year, the month, and the day. Once I create this value, I cannot change it. I can assign a different value into that date variable, even though the datetime exposes members like add days, which makes it look like I can add one day to an existing datetime value. But this code has a problem because add days will never change the underlying datetime value. Instead, what add days will do is return a new datetime instance. So I need to assign the return value of add days into a variable if I really want to capture the date. The string type in .NET also has these qualities. What's interesting about string is that string is a reference type. And as I said before, don't let anyone tell you that string is not a reference type. When working with strings, your variables will be a reference that point to a sequence of characters, and that makes it easy to pass strings around to different methods because we pass a reference instead of copying the entire value of the string. And that's good because strings can contain millions of characters and can be quite large. A string is a reference type then, but it behaves like a value type in many ways. Because a string is immutable, one of the methods on a string is a trim method. What trim will do is remove the leading or trailing white space from a string, so the space characters before and after the value Scott should be removed. But trim does not modify the string that I am pointing to. Instead, trim will create a new string with the characters removed and return that new string. If all I do is just call trim and I don't assign the return value of that method call to a variable, I've lost all the work that the trim method performed. And so the code on the screen is all wrong. Don't use it. Instead, use the code that I'll show you now. Inside of Visual Studio, let's experiment with the code that was just on the slide. So first, I will write a new test method. This test method will test how to add days to a date time. So first, I will need a datetime variable. Let's just call it date. And I could assign to that variable datetime.now. We've seen that earlier in the course. That will give me the current time as this program is executing. But instead, let's use a specific date. I can do that using the new keyword. And there is a constructor for datetime where I can pass in the year, let's say 2015. And then the month, let's just use January. And then the day of the month, let's just use the first day. And there's also constructors that would allow me to construct that day with a specific time during the day. But let's go with that value and now say datetime.addDays 1. And like I say, it's very easy to think that now you have a datetime that represents January 2nd. But if I write an assert, and I try to assert that the following two things are equal, the value 2 and date dot day, I will find this test will fail. Before I do that, I'll just point out that there's all sorts of ways to look at various different pieces of the date. I could look at the specific hour or the specific millisecond, but I just want to look at the day. And if I run the test, the failing test will tell me that I expected a 2, but the actual value is 1. So date.day is still a 1, and that's because add days will construct a new date time. So let me assign that new date time into the date variable and run the test again. And now we have a passing test. Next, let's try something with a string. So another test method, and let's test how to uppercase a string. So if I have a string variable, let's call it name, and I point it to the string Scott with all lowercase characters. And yes, I do point it to that string value because if I press F12 on string, I do see that it is a class defined inside of MS Core Lib. And you'll notice the class name is actually uppercase S. It just so happens that once again, C# provides a magic keyword string with a lowercase letter that will map to that system.string type. So the two are equivalent. C# is a case-sensitive language. So if I didn't have that keyword in C#, I would have to say string uppercase S. But now that we know that, let's try to do something with our name. Ultimately, what I want to do is invoke the toUpper method, which is one of many methods on the string type that looks like it would change the underlying string. So you can trim a string, you can trim from the start or trim just from the end. You can say toUpper, toLower. But if I write an assertion here and try to assert that the value I expect is Scott, all uppercase, and compare that to the actual value, which is the value in name, if I run this test, I will find that it fails. Because even though string is a reference type, it behaves very much like a value type. And I can see that I expected an all uppercase Scott, but I actually got an all lowercase Scott. And that's because all of these methods like trim and toUpper and toLower, they don't modify the string that I'm pointing to. Instead, they create a new string and return that string from the method. So I really need to capture that by assigning a reference to that new string back into my name variable. And once I do that and I run all the tests, I should find that this passes, which it does. And hopefully this will save you some time in the future. Always remember when working with a value type that the value type might be immutable, that methods you see on that value type might be methods that return a new value or a new instance and not change the underlying value. And that rule also applies to string, which behaves like a value type.